Hello, and thank you for watching the short subject, How can ransomware still be a threat? Or perhaps more appropriately, how ransomware can still be a threat. Now, if we look at a traditional security operations center model, most organizations are moving towards a very advanced level of capability from a detection and response standpoint. And in the financial services, insurance, and government organizations, they're even going further and building fusion centers, which is the culmination of many different organizations working together under a single roof within a company, trying to understand what's going on so that they can better deal with it. Now, that is a great way to handle advanced persistent threats and next generation threats. The biggest consideration, though, is that people spend so much time focusing on those advanced threats that the more basic things, like Trojans and worms and viruses, things that have known definitions, typically get overlooked. And it's not to say that they're not being recorded or captured somehow, but most researchers focus their time on the stuff that they consider to be the scariest. So in a typical security operations center, you've got people that are focused on intrusion alerts and issues with flow bias in the network and problems with alerting on assets. But you've got this little tiny alarm going off in the corner that nobody seems to notice. And that could be the most dangerous thing in your environment right now. Really, it comes down to this. Now, I did a short subject on automation, and I weigh the difference between, from advanced persistent threats, whether it makes more sense to focus on automation or control. Now, for advanced persistent threat, I actually contend that it's better to have more control than more automation. But that's only one piece of your overall network posture, because the reality of it is, this is what your environment looks like. You are balancing how you handle advanced persistent threat and the new scary stuff versus all the mundane everyday stuff. And each one is its own balance beam, all balanced on a balance beam that's focused on your organization. And the fulcrum of that bigger balance beam is up for you to decide. Sometimes it's your business operations, sometimes it's your finances, sometimes it's your shareholders, or it is something else that only you understand. But when we get into the topic of malware, although I feel like control is better than automation for advanced persistent threat, when we look at what happened most recently, I would contend that automation is actually better than control. And I'm going to show you a little story why. So if we start with an individual that has their laptop out, let's say, for example, they decide that they are traveling, or that they have just simply decided not to go to the office. So they head over to a coffee shop, and up pops our friend with his laptop. And as he's using it, that laptop somehow contracts malware. And that malware is spreading throughout that coffee shop, which means everybody in that coffee shop who has a device that is susceptible has contracted the same type of malware. Now, this person doesn't know that they've got it. So when they leave and they go and join a bunch of friends for dinner and pop up at the end of the table, they start to inherently infect all of their family, friends, and relatives. Then when they go into their office, they show up there in the office with their device, and then they start infecting people in the office. Now, this is a very common model. It seems overly simplistic, but this is still happening. And sometimes it's happening because there is some type of new code that is out there that's very scary stuff. But a lot of times it happens because of simple carelessness or overlooking something. But what happens either way is, even in these environments, you've got the coffee shop and people's friends and family, and in the office, you've still got the bad actors that are out there, and they're getting exactly what they want. And they're not after your data in this particular example. They're after cash, cold hard cash, because every one of these devices that they've impacted, they now get to charge the owner of that device to get their own information back. And in the most recent example that's just happened, it was $300 per device if they paid immediately. Then it went up to $600. And if they didn't pay after, I think it was a week or a week and a half, their devices became permanently locked. So how do we deal with this, right? And the answer is there's really only one thing you need to do, and it's patch your systems. Now, again, this doesn't apply to everything all the time, but this will address many, many known, commonly identified types of malware and code out there. And this is where we get into the topic of automation. So let's look at the most recent thing. So we see that there is this big ransomware attack, 99 plus countries, large organizations, small organizations, healthcare organizations, governments. It's affected everybody. And it's very recent. It just happened. But 60 days ago, the manufacturer of the operating system knew about it and released a patch for it. And systems that were properly patched before this ransomware broke out weren't affected by the ransomware. And in fact, the guidance being provided is to simply patch your systems. So if our friend here from the very beginning, when he saw this little update pop up on their screen, just clicked the button yes, they could have potentially prevented the entire chain of events that infected the coffee shop, all of his friends' family, as well as everybody at work. But the problem is that we don't deal with individuals. We deal with corporations. And a corporation can't click the yes button because the corporation has to deal with things like testing and QA of the patches, change management, asset discovery, OS diversity, and globalization. All of these things are significant factors towards applying even the simplest patch. Do we know where all the devices are? Do we know which devices need to get patches? Do we understand which ones are critical first? Which ones can't be rebooted at a certain time of day? Who's up when? What the impact of this patch is going to be to other specific software that we're running on our images? All of these things become complications. And the very obvious, yes, let's update becomes a definitive maybe. Now, I know it sounds like I'm just creating a problem without proposing a solution, but the reality of it is there are a few things that even large organizations can do to help prevent themselves ending up in these locked out environments where they're paying a bad actor hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to get their data back. So let's look at the game plan for that. So the first thing is, and this is always going to be the first thing when it comes to security, is the human factor. Do people understand the threats that exist? Do they understand the exposure that they have when they walk out of their building and off of the corporate environment and into coffee shops and public spaces and train stations and airports and restaurants? Making sure that people understand just how vulnerable those systems are, especially on a corporate patching schedule, will help avoid quite a bit of the problems. But the second thing is it has to be no device left behind. There is no such thing as a trivial asset in your environment. Everything counts. And that's particularly important because in this most recent string of malware, it propagated laterally once it got in your environment. So just a single infected machine on a network found and infected every other vulnerable machine on the network. So even if you have things that should be isolated, they're not isolated at all. If they're touching a network, they're touching the internet, and you can pretty much bet on that. So every device is critical, absolutely every one of them. The next one is a little bit more controversial, but the concept of security, not operations. Most people would categorize patch management and asset management as an operations function. I would contend that that doesn't exist. There is no pure operations function anymore. Everything is security. And you cannot use operations tools, operations telemetry gathering systems, operational log managers to do the job of security tools because you are going to miss things. And if those operations tools have the ability to act like a security tool, the chances of it catching everything in near real time without requiring coding and maintenance and special patching and updates is going to be less than buying the right tool for the job in the first place. And it's not to say there isn't a place for operations tools, because you need the ability to archive massive volumes of random telemetry like CPU data and memory utilization. But make sure you have the right tool for the job, and everything is a function of security first. And then finally, you should always plan for the worst. Because if you do these 4 things, then there's a couple of key things you have the ability to do that you wouldn't have before. Things like automatically roll out a patch that is still in test if your security team detects a breach that could be resolved by the patch in question. Like quarantining systems that have been impacted even if you can't roll out a patch. Like shutting down network communications and traffic to the internet if you detect these types of things going on based on anomalous data from your patch management or your endpoint management systems. If you do not do all of these things, make sure people are trained. Assume every device is critical. Think about things in construct of security and not just operations, and always have a plan for the worst. You will be in much better shape than you could be if you continue to operate under the assumption that patches are only for critical systems and that patches and asset data are not part of your security plan. And then finally, as you do plan for the worst, make sure you have your executive dashboards, make sure you have playbooks, make sure you know who to call, so that if something happens and you get a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning and it's your board, you know exactly what to say to them, and you've got a plan to help fix your organization and maybe even save a few careers in the process. Thank you, and good luck.